Welcome to the Crazy Wisdom podcast. My guest here is Ben Reinhardt. He is an EIR at Entrepreneur First in Singapore and the host of the Idea Machine podcast. Really excited to have you on and talk about the global rise in technology production, not only focused in Silicon Valley, but all around the world. And that's why you moved to Singapore, as you were just talking about. So really excited to talk about that. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
So why Singapore?
So part of it is serendipity that I had in my head that I wanted to test out this hypothesis that Asia is the correct place to build new things, especially new systems. So things that help people build things. So that was one of those things that was like vaguely in the back of my head. And I was sort of exploring what I was going to do next. And I was talking to this guy. He said, "Oh, have you heard of Entrepreneur First?" And I had not. So that later that evening, I looked it up, thought, "Oh, this is interesting," and just saw that they had a job opening in Singapore. So I applied. One thing led to the next, and then I was moving across the world a few weeks later.
And for those of my listeners who don't know what an EIR is, can you give them a little bit more insight into that?
Yeah. So EIR stands for Entrepreneur in Residence. It is one of the most vague job titles in the world. And so if you meet anybody else with a job title EIR, you cannot assume that they do what I do. So it basically means it's like someone who's started something before, is vaguely between things, and generally helps out. I think that's the one thing that EIRs do all over the world. For me specifically, I am in a much more sort of hands-on role in the company, so I help a lot with ops. I do some special projects, and then spend a lot of my time working directly with people in the Entrepreneur First program to sort of help them start companies. So I'm sort of like a coach, mentor type person.
So Singapore, what is the most interesting thing you've learned about the Singapore ecosystem for startups in the last month or two?
Oh, man. So I think the most interesting thing that I've learned is one, that really almost every startup in the sort of Southeast Asia ecosystem wants to at least have an office here, because this is the place in Southeast Asia that has the strongest rule of law. So Vietnam and Indonesia are experiencing crazy growth as a market. But the laws are very ill-defined and constantly changing. That's one thing. The other is that the Singaporean government is working very hard to transform Singapore's economy from a primarily sort of shipping-based economy to something that's really around deep tech and knowledge creation. And so they've really put a lot of help behind the startup ecosystem here, which I think in America, you would look at the government trying to help something like this and really dismiss it. The interesting thing is that when the Singapore government wants something to get done, it tends to actually get done, which is a very different thing.
Spending time there, I can definitely attest to that Singapore works perfectly. It seems like it just works almost to a point of like Disneyland feeling.
Yeah. People have described it as Disneyland with the death sentence.
And it's funny because there's this island called Sentosa Island, which is like a Disneyland within Singapore. But I just felt like I was moving from one Disneyland to the next when I went there.
Well, it's Disneyland's all the way down here. If you go to Sentosa, there's the Disneyland inside of the Disneyland. It's very secret.
So I'm really curious, what is the relationship between Singapore and China? What is the feeling you get being there in terms of maybe the tech ecosystems or even just geopolitically? What is the sense that you get being in Singapore, people living in Singapore versus what's happening in China?
Yeah, so the relationship is primarily a cultural one. If you just look at the demographics of Singapore, the majority of the population identifies as Chinese descended. And something that I didn't realize before I moved to Asia is that when they say Chinese, they they think of it as an ethnicity and sort of a cultural identity more so than just a nationality. So that's the biggest tie, is that there are just many people in Singapore who identify as Chinese, not the nationality. But then on a sort of government front, I was actually at a presentation by people from the Singaporean government, and honestly, they sort of see themselves as a bridge between China, the East, and the more Western countries. And you really see that played out where you walk down the streets and everything is both in Chinese and in English. And so that's really how they're trying to position themselves. I think it's fairly tricky, and we'll see how it plays out. In terms of the tech ecosystems, they're really quite distinct. It's basically China and not China. I go to Hong Kong for work as well and talk to people in the tech ecosystem there. And even in Hong Kong, it's China and not China. And Hong Kong falls primarily into not China. So that's because at the end of the day, it's really about the money, and money you make in China, you cannot really deploy outside of China, and vice versa.
Unless it's through things like Bitcoin or Monero, right?
Right. I have not delved into that. If again, this may not be true. Didn't China recently outlaw using Bitcoin? So
I think they've done it a few times, but I don't think it actually makes a difference. I don't know. I don't know enough to say. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that a lot of Chinese money a lot of the main reason why Bitcoin is so popular is because of capital flight out of China, either whether that's clandestine or sanctioned.
Yeah, I would believe that. The problem is there's one thing where it's like getting your personal money out.
Yeah.
Another thing is operating as a business,
yep.
using it to transfer funds. And it's just like a whole nother thing, and they would audit your books. Yep. So as running a business, I would be much more concerned doing that. And so it just further, it doesn't break down those barriers between China startup ecosystem and not China.
Yeah, very interesting. And so Singapore, so you're not too much into the cryptocurrency. You're entrepreneur first. They don't get involved in too many cryptocurrency stuff, or?
I think we funded one cryptocurrency company before I got there. I am in the cryptocurrency world, I am skeptical and optimistic. So I'm mostly an outsider. I think that there are very cool things that could come out of it. I just have not honestly had the bandwidth to wade in and do my own research on what is BS and what is real. So that's really my position on it. We primarily help sort of any kind of deep tech. I'm making scare quotes for listeners, making deep tech companies, which basically means companies where technology is one of their core value propositions. So we will fund and help people build crypto companies, but I just find that the majority of crypto companies could just be better done by being a database.
Yeah, that's true. And so what are some interesting companies that have come out of Entrepreneur First?
So right now, I've been there for about 6 months. So I'll speak to the ones that I've worked with in the past cycle. There's a company using drones to deliver goods to ships out at sea. Normally you have to get it, like if you want to get a bolt out to a boat, you have to give a guy a bolt. He has to get into a little motorboat to drive the motorboat out to the big boat and deliver the bolt. This seems wildly inefficient. So they're actually using drones to do that. It's back on the point of Singapore being a good place to build new things. This is something that would absolutely never happen in the United States because of regulation. Also worked with people doing everything from using aerogels to create next generation insulation for shipping pharmaceuticals, to people using algae to clear out the air in office buildings, to people trying to break down plastic. It's really sort of all over the map in terms of what's going on.
And are most of these entrepreneurs from Singapore itself or from the rest of the world?
I don't know the exact breakdown, but they're really from everywhere. We have people from all across the world. Usually many of them are already in Singapore because of school or jobs. There's some very good universities here, and that tends to sort of be a magnet for people from all over the world.
Interesting. What is your favorite thing about living in Singapore so far?
My favorite thing about living in Singapore so far? I think it's either the multiculturalism, where it's just I work with, I think I counted it, people from just my office of 25 people. I think we have 12 nationalities represented. That, or just, everybody will say this, but the public transportation is amazing.
And the food too.
The food's pretty good. Honestly, California food's better.
Really?
I hope they don't kick me out of the country, but I like California food better.
Yeah. Just don't chew gum as well, because then.
Yes, correct.
Yeah. And so you've got this podcast called Idea Machines Podcast. What's that about?
So my focus there is on systems that help turn imagination to reality. That's sort of the very broad view, but basically I feel like we spend a lot of time looking at the things that come out of what I would call innovation systems. So sort of systems of interlocking organizations and people that sort of help shepherd someone being like, aha, I have an idea, to something in the world that's impacting people's lives. We spend so much time looking at the outcomes where we're like, the iPhone, the polio vaccine, it's amazing. But we don't step back and say, okay, why, how did these things come to exist? What were the chain of events? What were the chain of organizations that all had their hands in making these things exist? And the reason I'm really interested in that is because I think that the only way that we can make the systems better and build new systems is by looking at how they work now.
And have you ever heard of the book Loonshots by Safi Bahcall?
I am in love with that book.
Yeah.
I did a giant Twitter thread about how much I love that book. So yes.
You should reach out to him. He does interviews. And I interviewed him, and he's fantastic.
Oh, that's amazing. Yes. I cannot recommend that book enough. I think it's the one book I've read about sort of making new things that's not just completely anecdote based, where it at least attempts to say like, okay, like here's some theory of organizations.
Yep. And it's great because it comes from his background in biology, and we are at our core biological beings, and so it's great because it gets into that, and I really love that framework. And I love how he ties it all in the end, he ties it all into world history and all these other things as well. So it's a really cool book. Yeah.
I'm interested. How did you end up discovering it? Because I honestly, it was just through like a random connection told me to read it.
I think it was on Twitter. I think I saw it I think I saw his interview. I didn't listen to the interview, but I think I saw a tweet from AZ16 after their interview with him. I think that's how I found about it. And then I reached out to him and did the interview. And I've been doing this other kind of series for my podcast where I reach out to somebody and ask them what they're reading, not the author themselves, but somebody who's reading the book. And then I read it, and then we have a conversation about the book.
That's a really good idea.
Yeah. So I was going to do that with somebody else, but they backed out. But then I ended up just having the conversation with him. I really like it because with a podcast, you can get trapped in a kind of author cycle where you're going after authors, because authors always want to get their work out. So they're always open to but then you become kind of known as a author podcast. So it's like,
Yeah.
so that was my one author podcast. So, no.
Yeah. No, I love the idea of getting off the author train.
Yep.
Have you ever noticed how because there so many authors go on podcasts, generally you can avoid reading the book by just sort of listening to 3 podcasts with the same author and then kind of triangulating
Interesting.
what the main points of the book are.
That was part of the reason I started this other podcast, was that I could put a piece of content out there that would help people, if they don't want to take the time to read the book, then get the understandings of the book.
Yeah.
But then the one issue with that is that what somebody's pointed out is that a book is basically like spaced repetition memorization. If you take a long time to read the book, usually a lot of authors will repeat the points and then come back to the main point and bring all these other threads. So it's like repetition over a long period of time. Whereas if you only listen to a podcast episode once about the book, it's very unlikely to stick inside your head.
Right. That's why you need 3.
Yeah. That's why you need what?
That's why you need 3.
Yeah, exactly.
Number is three different podcasts.
Very cool. Interesting. And what is the biggest thing you've learned from doing this podcast?
Oh man. I think the biggest thing that I've learned, I'm very bad at figuring out the one single biggest thing. So I'm gonna give just a couple of top things. One is that it is much harder to make a good podcast than I thought. When I went into it, I thought, oh, it's easy. I'll just record a conversation and then put it on the internet. But that there's just a lot of pieces, even for something that's not heavily edited. There's still many pieces. I learned that. I learned that Upwork is awesome, which is directly related to the first point. I work with an amazing editor via Upwork, and I don't know how I would do it. And I think I knew this already, but everybody likes attention, and so it makes it everybody's excited to do podcasts.
And it's funny because I thought that as well, but then I've been noticing that it's maybe it's the subject I'm interviewing people about. I'm interviewing people about kind of like stress and like difficult things. So it's so oftentimes it's hard for me to get the guest members to share what they've been doing. And so that makes me think it's not necessarily about attention, because if it was attention, then they would want to share it. But it feels almost like it's goodwill, and that they just want to get their message out so that maybe helps. That might be a rosy tinted view of things, but what do you think?
I think I think that people tell themselves that, but and again, maybe it's different people. I think it's more that it's people are more willing to have a conversation on a podcast than they are just in just talking one-on-one. And yeah, and so that's what makes me feel like, well, the difference is really the attention levels from it.
And that is a very interesting thing that I definitely is very clear that that's true. It's so funny that put a microphone in front of people and all of a sudden it's easy to get people to say yes. Whereas before it's like, if I asked somebody out to coffee, like half the people would no way they'd answer.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. On the flip side, do you ever have this experience where you're having a conversation with someone over coffee and you really wish that it had been recorded, and you're like, oh, this would have made the best podcast, and I can't really ask you to like have the same conversation with me. But
and that's really interesting, because that gets into, this is a question I was asking on Twitter the other day. What happens? What are the dynamics? How do the dynamics of a conversation change once you put a microphone in front of somebody? You'd probably be a good person to have some thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one is there's less riffing. I think that when we right now, if we don't have a microphone in front of us, it's much more free flowing because right now you're the interviewer, I'm the interviewee,
Mhm.
and I'm sort of uh, depending on you to push forward. So it either has that dynamic, and either I will answer the question and stop, but wait for you to ask another question, or the flip side, I'll just keep talking and talking and talking because I'm
Mm.
the guest on the podcast and I have all the
Mm.
things to say.
Interesting.
What do you think?
Yeah, so definitely, but it changes for guest to guest. Sometimes, and this gets into another question I asked on Twitter. What's the difference between a conversation and an interview? And I would say that sometimes it feels like conversations, and sometimes it feels like interviews, because there is this sense of role. There is like I'm really comfortable playing this role of asking questions and stuff like that. I'm less comfortable getting questions asked to me, although I like doing it. I want to try more, but so there's a role, and that it does. There is definitely, when I reach out to people and I ask them, hey, do you want to do an interview? I'm expected to lead the entire thing the whole way through. But then in a conversation, and it was really funny. I had my first conversation type podcast with this guy named Kapil Gupta, who I was like, okay, this is my theme. And he's like, no, I don't do themes. I don't want any sort of theme that destroys truth. That's going to make it impossible to find the truth. Conversations about finding the truth. So we're not going to have a theme. Like, okay, let's do it. And that was really interesting because I went in that with no questions and no theme. A lot of awkward silences, like 10 minutes of silence one time. And so it's really interesting to have that. Cause now I like just conversations. Like if people want questions beforehand, like I didn't give you any questions. I sent you a doc and everything like that. So this feels a little bit more like a conversation, but
I think that conversations are both more valuable.
Mm.
At the same time, they are they're less coherent and they're slightly harder to listen to sometimes. I have recorded conversations, just like not for a podcast. It was literally just like, hey, like let's get coffee. I'm gonna record this. Can I record this? And listening back through it, it's kind of a mess. If you actually listen to how we talk, we stutter, we repeat ourselves, and and I'm not sure how much harder it is for your listeners to actually pay attention to it. But I think that at least in my head, it's harder for people to pay attention to when I'm actually just talking to you, as opposed to talking to you and the audience. And so whether it's real or imagined, I think that may be one of the other differences where we're actually a little bit in performance mode.
Yeah, that definitely shows up. As soon as you put the microphone on in front of somebody's face, performance mode shows up, which I find leads to better conversations that are more publishable, which is fun. And I really enjoy it. But then it also has led me to have more interesting conversations in my personal life as well, because it allows me to, I've learned all these things about having a conversation that are very difficult to learn unless you do a lot of them and have this performance mode type of conversation as well.
Interesting. What do you think are some of the things?
The biggest one is getting more of an intuition into a good question to ask somebody that'll get a conversation started, and doing that as quickly as possible. So it's really allowed me to cut through a lot of small talk in parties, because I can get to, for example, I start asking people, what's the craziest thing that happened to you this week? And there's an awkward silence usually when I ask that question, because people have to sit and think. But as long as I'm comfortable with it, they're comfortable with it, and we just have the awkward silence, and then they bring up something, and then we get into a conversation that's free flowing and stuff like that. Mm-hmm.
Nice. It also weeds out the boring people really fast.
Yep. Yeah.
They're like nothing, and you're like, oh great, I don't have to talk to you.
Yeah. That conversation's over. So, and then you said something else that was really interesting. About when you went back and listened to the conversation, which brings up another really interesting kind of thing that I've seen happening, where I'll have the conversation, I'll think that it went a particular way, and then I'll listen to it and realized that it went in a completely different way that I wasn't expecting. Do you ever get that?
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I think it's a testament to how our memories are not perfect,
Yep.
right? Like everybody always says, it's like, oh, human memories are really bad. And then you go back and you listen to this and you're like, oh wow, yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
I remember this completely differently.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. Did you? There's the really interesting anecdote on that I've heard on a podcast with an author that I don't have to read his book. Sorry, author whose name I don't remember. Was that they did this study where this one psychology professor, immediately after the Challenger explosion, had all of his students write down like what happened that day and what their feelings were of that. And then I think like 10, 20 years later, he had them come back in and write down what they were feeling and what they were, what happened that day. And then he brought out the old papers, and one, they were different. And two, the students insisted that the old ones were wrong. They said, no, that's impossible. That is absolutely not what happened. That is absolutely not what I was feeling. This is really what I was feeling. It's like,
and it's so interesting because it's like, once you really understand that and understand the science behind what memory really is and what happens when we remember something, you just realize that most of our childhood memories are false. Like most of our memories of the last month are not accurate, to say the least. And so when you think about that, it really kind of changes your understanding of like what's actually happening right now as well, because the thing that is recording this inside of my head is not as accurate as the microphone I've got next to me, and is not as accurate as the video that we're doing. So it becomes really hard to trust ourselves when it comes to remembering things. But then there's also a part of our brains that ignores that completely and thinks that we're right as well, like no matter what.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think the takeaway that I have from that is just having a little bit of humility around the past. I think is just like be open to the fact that you may be wrong, even if you're really, really sure you're right and it happened that way. I think is sort of my takeaway from all of that.
So I kind of want to bring it back to Singapore and your understanding of it. Maybe even
totally.
What's that?
I said totally.
Okay, yeah, and maybe even geopolitically. So Singapore is this city, and it's right on the Straits of Malacca, right? And it's like right there in the shipping channel between China and India. And Southeast Asia itself has always been the central place between China and India, two huge places that have just kind of like influenced it so much in terms of religion, culture, all these different things. Where, with the rise of China and some would say relative decline of the US, although that's an arguable point, and maybe the rise of Africa as well, and maybe the rise of India, what is Singapore's 5 to 10 year kind of like trajectory?
Yeah, so I can speak to this. I am absolutely not the expert. I can point everybody at many more people who think much more about this. I think that honestly, Singapore is still trying to figure it out. They obviously have a plan, but at the end of the day, it is a country of around 7 million people. So compared to everything else, it's really, really tiny. And so the other, like everything else that happens will affect Singapore. So on the note of it being on a major shipping channel, for anybody who has not been to Singapore, the first time you fly in, it's kind of incredible, especially at night, because it looks like you're flying over a city where it's just lights as far as the eye can see, but every single one of those lights is a ship that is docked off of the coast. So it's just absurd, the number of ships. So it really is this shipping channel. And just one other aside on that, something that someone pointed out to me recently that may actually affect Singapore more than any sort of geopolitics is actually whether or not the Earth warms enough that there is a free shipping lane in the Arctic, because basically all of the shipping traffic that comes past Singapore could more easily go through the Arctic if that actually happened. And so Singapore's economy might be completely fucked if ships don't have to go through the strait at all. So that's actually going to, so one of the reasons that Singapore is so, I mentioned that they're really focused on building up the sort of tech in their economy, is that what they're trying to do is make themselves not dependent on this shipping and not dependent on these geopolitics at all. So I guess I could say like that's part of their 5-year plan, is just trying to make it so that all of these geopolitics don't matter. And what they're doing is they're really just producing really valuable knowledge work and technology. So that's, yeah.
And that's the very interesting thing about Singapore in relation to tech, it seems like, is that it is a place where there's rule of law, as you said, and so if you're going to be a global company, you can base it in the United States or you can base it in Singapore. It seems like those are the big two options, unless you're in Europe or China or something like that. But if you want to be a global company, it seems like, Silicon Valley or Singapore. Would that be a correct statement?
Yeah, that would be a correct statement. And generally both, actually. Like the companies that get very big in Singapore tend to also open up a Silicon Valley office and vice versa. Right now, the flow of companies is kind of that they get started and scale in the US and then move to Singapore more often than the other way around. And that's just because, so the dynamics of growing a company in the two different places is quite different, because in the US, you can get huge without ever having to worry about dealing with sort of like different countries, regulations and laws and localization, which is really quite nice. And then you can internationalize after that. Whereas in Singapore, you basically have to be international immediately because the market here is tiny.
Interesting.
So there's that very, very that difference of growth. And then just to go back to how everything's with China, I think apparently what has happened, I was talking to a taxi driver, is that it hurts Singapore's economy, because a lot of the shipping in Singapore used to involve taking like one big boat of goods would come in, and then they would distribute it into a bunch of other boats that would then go other places. But so many of the ships just go straight to China. A lot of that work now gets done in Shanghai, and a lot of the shipping of smaller, more valuable goods has actually moved to air freight, which goes through Hong Kong. So Hong Kong is the world's largest air freight port. And so that all of that commerce has actually moved away from Singapore as well. So I think on a very large level, the sort of the rise of China has hurt Singapore's old economy in terms of like logistics.
And then that kind of leads to what you were talking about earlier, was why they're making that switch to tech, because that kind of gives them access to something that's not reliant on shipping as well.
Exactly. So it's like the whole, I think the majority of Singapore's initiatives are all really focused around sort of independence. So they have they do tons of research to try to make themselves food independent, water independent.
Oh, interesting.
Right. So Singapore imports a ton of food, and that makes them dependent on other countries. I think they actually have achieved water independence, which is completely different than the situation they were in 40 years ago.
Through desalinization or how?
I think so. I think they have a real. So that may be wrong.
Uh-huh.
We should fact check that.
Yeah, yeah,
But
yeah.
I do know that at least occasionally they do export water to Malaysia.
Interesting. Yeah, I'll definitely read up more on that. That sounds like an interesting thing. And the food independence also sounds really interesting. Do you know of any startups that are succeeding in terms of food production? Or
Um, Honestly, no. I think this may be one of those goals that they fall short on.
mm,
Um, we'll see. I'm hoping it's one of those sort of exponential curve type things where right now it looks like progress is really slow, but they'll ramp up very
mm,
quickly. Um, you can always tell in Singapore what is important and what is not important because there's
uh,
this class of food where the price is equal to or lower than it is in the US. This is like eggs and chicken.
mm,
And then there's some food where it's just wildly more expensive
mm.
in the US. I used to eat a lot of Greek yogurt and cottage cheese before I moved here. And then just that habit became completely unsustainable
Mm.
when I moved because of the price difference.
Interesting. Uh, so we got about 5 minutes left. What is one thing that you've read, a concept you've read, or an idea, or a book that has most changed your life in the last month, or most influenced your life?
And so I would have said loon shots, but we already talked about that. So let me look at what's on my desk. Actually, so can I again? I'm going to do two because I'm annoying like that. One is this book called The Systems Bible.
Mm,
It's actually it was originally written, I believe, in the 70s, and um, I think it just pushes back against everybody who is uh, obsessed with systems as like the solution to everything,
mm,
um, and basically like talks about systems from a very realistic standpoint of like, okay, like this is how they fail, and this is how you like just cannot. This is the limit of how good they are.
mm.
And I think that really enforces. So I don't know. Do you know the concept of like story thinking and systems thinking?
I do know about systems thinking. I've never heard of story thinking before.
So story thinking is kind of like the opposite of systems thinking. So in the a tech lens, I think of story thinking is really what designers do,
Mm,
and systems thinking is what engineers do.
mm,
I think that depending on who you hang out with, one is usually over, like people value one over the other.
mm.
And I think that this book really helps you see that you need both. So that's one. The other is right now I'm reading this book called Power,
Mm.
and it is just the
I think
most.
I read that.
Yeah, I am really digging it because it is one of the most just like raw,
Yeah.
honest breakdowns of power,
Yep.
how it works, how people get it, and it's just very refreshing because it goes against all the leadership books that are like, oh yeah, just like be a good person
Not
and
everyone.
by example, and you'll succeed. And this is like, no, honestly, like no, that's how you screw yourself over. Uh,
Yeah,
and it's not, and it's just like all these uncomfortable truths.
uh-huh.
I really like books that are like that.
Totally. That really kind of force you to confront your own understanding of how things get done, and because you have to adapt you don't have to adapt to the whole thesis, but you bring in certain points that are like, oh, okay, I guess I never thought about that. That does seem kind of true.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mhm. Well, cool. Thank you so much. How can people find more about what you're doing, your podcast, anything you're interested in?
Yeah. So I think Twitter and my podcast are the best. Twitter, I'm just at Ben Reinhardt, and my podcast is ideamachinespodcast.com.
Cool. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, this is great.
Cool.
Great to